government paper that says, yeah, Brooke has.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hi.
Hello.
My name is Ginger Olszewski, and I'd like to thank you all for coming out this afternoon. This afternoon, our Conroy Center is pleased to host T.D. Johnston for a discussion of his newly released debut novel, Reciprocity. In a recent review of the novel in Low Country Weekly, author John McElroy praised Reciprocity as a brawny, unflinching, and full-bodied book, yet it reads quickly like the very best of Johnston's short stories. Simmering with suspense and surprise, a heart-pounding spirit not compromised by surplus narrative detours. For those who like their whiskey strong and top shelf, and who aren't afraid of tackling the hard questions of choice, in the shadows of a sinful and often broken world, this is a must-read book. Tim Johnston previously won the 2017 International Book Award for Best Short Fiction and Friday Afternoon and Other Stories. His stories have appeared in numerous magazines and literary journals, and the title story of his award-winning collection was made into an acclaimed short film. Since 2010, he has served as a series editor and publisher at Short Story America, a quality literary press specializing in anthologies and collections of short fiction by today's authors. Johnston taught world literature, American literature, and creative writing at several of America's top college preparatory schools, and he headed 2 schools before leaving the academic world to focus on writing and editing full-time. He lives with his wife and 3 children in Jacksonville, Florida, and here in Beaufort. Please join me in welcoming T.D. Johnston.
Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. Appreciate that very much. Okay, Brooke is over here. Okay, I just wanted to see if Jonathan was here, because I have to say, I've never been in the new building. We moved to Jacksonville 4 years ago. We still have our home on Ladies Island because someday we're going to retire here, but for now the Airbnb people have to pay the mortgage for us. So this is the way. I'm not even staying there this weekend, can't, somebody else is there. But I had been in the previous incarnations of Pat Conroy Literary Center. I have to say, I trust that this is the permanent home. In view of the water, lots of room, a great event room. This is a fabulous facility, and what great homage it pays to the great Pat Conroy, what you've done, Brooke and everyone else, to curate his legacy is first rate, and that's with apologies for the understatement. And so I've told several people since being in town, including last night over at Beaufort Bookstore, I'm just happy now to have my name in any way associated with the Pat Conroy Literary Center, because this is sure to be a destination as popular as it is already. I am sure that a lot of merchants in Beaufort are going to owe a lot to the Pat Conroy Literary Center for the tourism that it's generating, but will in exponential ways in the future. I'll certainly be sending a lot of people up from Florida. I guarantee you of that. So as the introduction said, I come from the world of short stories, both as a writer and before that as a teacher. My undergrad degree is in English from Davidson College. What did I like the most in studying literature in college? I loved short fiction. Whether it was the Americans or the British, French, Russians, I loved short fiction. I really started to love short stories beginning in middle school, and that's not something I hear often enough today. You know, the kids love short stories. It's honestly, it's because they're not being taught enough. I'm going to get on my bandbox to start this, because any of you who can have any influence on those who determine curriculum in school, short stories should be used at a far greater frequency in middle and high school. And I would say the same for poetry. There's probably enough done with novels, but the problem being a writing teacher with using a lot of novels in curriculum is there are fewer writing opportunities. I loved department chairs who allowed me to teach short stories to students, right up through world literature to seniors when I taught in Atlanta, short story, they don't need me going to Google for a synopsis. They're not going to cheat. They're going to read the story. It's not that long a sitting. They also knew there'd be a pop quiz that wasn't going to be pulled from any Google synopsis, but they were going to like them. The math kids were going to discover, wait, I'm not just math science. I think I like literature. The short story, one sitting, one or two great discussions, and the 500-word essay. Analytical, persuasive, expository, whatever it might be, you can write about every short story. So I always taught short stories. Whatever I was allowed to do, that's what I did. And then I decided to keep a promise I'd made myself as an English major in college. Now that I feel like somewhat of an expert on the form, and I've taught analysis to students, I'm going to start writing them. Finally felt ready. When I was 21, I was going to do it and didn't write my first one until I was 38 years old. And over time, whatever it is that seeps in, as Stephen King has said, if you're going to write something, make sure you read in that form hundreds or thousands of times, or you're not ready. And I believe that very much. So I've had whatever a short story writer can call success in a world where short story writers that don't have a last name like King or occasionally Grisham or people like that don't land on the New York Times bestseller list. Doesn't mean that today's short story writers aren't just as good as the famous ones before TV and radio and internet. They are, and I know a couple hundred of them personally that I've published in the Short Story America series, writers from around the United States and around the world. I'm telling you, the form is in great shape. We just need more people reading the form and finding out, oh, I've been missing out on some great reads, great single sitting reads. Look at how we entertain ourselves. Single sitting movies, TV shows. So the short story is poised, I think, for a potentially huge comeback. And I've written two collections that I'm very proud of. The first, I was very surprised, happily surprised, won a book award, beat out 500 or 600 other collections. And so now I've got two. My second collection, titled Waiting for Eisenhower, has only been made available in limited edition, signed directly through Short Story America, because my agent is now shopping it to bigger publishers. So it's off the Amazon market, it's out of the bookstore market until something either happens or doesn't happen with that. So after decades of immersion in short stories, I thought I am going to try finding out what happens when a short story writer who loves reading novels says, all right, I think it's a different type of self-discipline. Probably involves a lot more routine, a lot more commitment to routine than short fiction necessarily does. And I have now written Reciprocity. My next two novels are already finished and in the hands of my agent. And one is titled The Daffodil Society. The third one is titled The Furtherer. And I'm not going to do any descriptions or spoilers here, but I think that reviewers will call them thrillers, as they have with Reciprocity. They are thrillers. Not necessarily crime thrillers, but thrillers. And the fourth one is called The Temple of the Graces. I'm about 80% through the first draft. Writers in the room know there's many multiples of that coming, but ultimately that will go to my agent as well. We'll see what has happened with those other two by then. But I have fallen in love with the long form. I think I was a little afraid of it, because I always loved reading thrillers. I grew up reading Alistair MacLean and Robert Love.
Oh, good.
A very, very strong devotee of both MacLean and Ludlum, to where if I was hiding books in English class, it's because I was reading the next Alistair MacLean novel. I couldn't get enough of those books, and so I did know that if I ever wrote novels, I would probably gravitate towards the level of both a plot sequence and suspense and multi-character point of view that I saw in some of their work and the work of a guy like Ken Follett. When I read Eye of the Needle in high school, it exposed me to multiple character point of view in a traditional third-person anonymous narration in a way that could bring an epic story towards a convergence of key characters in a hold your breath type of situation. I always loved that kind of book. So that's what I did with Reciprocity, or tried to do with Reciprocity, but so far the reviewers are saying, yeah, that's what you did. I'm very happy with the response to it, and so, okay, I can write in the long form. And, to writers in the room, I would say if there's a form you enjoy as a reader and you haven't written in that form, don't think, oh, well, I'm too far down the road, I can't really change my ways. It is a very different, it's a different approach. There are ways in which it's not different for me. How many writers are in the room? How many of you write with music? And that's about roughly half. And it's amazing. As I have toured for previous books, it's often a question Q&A. Sometimes the question pops up about process. Do you write with music or do you write in silence? And my answer is always the same. I do not write a word of fiction without music. It is central to the mood that I want to create for myself when I go into this world where I don't want to know anything else is going on. I might forget that there's music playing, because that's how deep you get into what's happening with these human souls that you've created. You got to become them. The forms, I think as I go around with this book, I'm pretty much always going to have to explain that some of my favorite writers have come from short stories. Stephen King came from short stories. He was very much a short story writer before he wrote Carrie. And you probably know the famous story about his own level of confidence. When it came to the switch over to the long form, he threw his one hard copy of Carrie in the trash. And his wife, his first editor, pulled it out. She knew it was good. But I don't know what it is about self-doubt that creeps in. Writers in the room, raise your hand if you experience self-doubt.
Don't you say it?
Yeah, it's like, how can this possibly be good or good enough for other people to invest their time and attention when it didn't exist a week ago? It came just from me? Well, it can't be. It can't be. I'm embarrassed. I can't put this out there. That's why, process-wise, I also use beta readers, people that are not my first cousin, who will tell me this is really good, or who will say, oh, come on, Pat, you having a bad day? And sometimes you write because you're in the habit. It doesn't mean you write something good that day. But before I move into some reading, I want to read you some short fiction, and I want to read you a snippet or two from Reciprocity. Are there any questions? I usually do some Q&A before I read, and I usually do some Q&A after I read, because the Q&A may have to do with what I read. Does anybody have any questions that they might have? Yes.
One. What would be your tips for becoming a really great storyteller? Like, do you have a sort of a methodology for crafting your story? Do you do the whole thing in advance? Do you do, I mean, it's easier with a short story, obviously, but when you're writing long, it's a whole different program.
Yeah, we talked about this very thing at Buford Bookstore last night. I do not outline. There are writers who only outline. And you have to do what works for you. If I were to, as I said last night, if I were to outline and then write to the outline, for me it would be a shoehorning. I would be shoehorning material into a story involving human souls I've created, but where I already know what's going to happen to them. My preference for my short stories, and I have discovered with my novels, is I want to create a situation that, just like with short stories, that has early tension. That is a situation that has the potential to develop into some level of conflict, whether external or internal. That much is, anyone who attends a master's program in creative writing is going to hear that. Okay, that's fairly much boilerplate. But what do you do then? You know, you create this situation. Whether it's a short story or the novel, I then write the rest of it to find out what happens. And I trust that it's going to come to me. What happens is going to unfold. If I trust that little voice in my ear, and at the end of the day, I have to like what I write. So I write what I am going to enjoy as a reader first. I am my first audience, and I have to be hard on myself in that way. If I come back 2 days later and I read what I wrote on Monday, if I don't like it, it goes. You know, and you can't say to yourself, God, it was 4 hours at the computer, for God's sakes, man. You know? Just keep it. You can tweak it. Well, often you can tweak it, and sometimes you love it. It's like, oh yeah, okay, that was good, and now I keep going. And sometimes you say, you know, I think there was something else on my mind, or I forced it. You know, I forced it. Well, what does he do now? I'll just make him do something, and where something doesn't necessarily come to you in that moment. Luckily for me, it tends to come, and I just trust it and I go with it. A lot of people last night had read my story Friday afternoon. Raise your hand if you read Friday afternoon before. Oh, that's a good number. Okay. Friday afternoon is a great example of a situation, of an author dropping the reader into a situation. In this case, a corporate executive, a dismissive individual named Bryce Stanford, and it's the job of the author to characterize that person, he's experienced a bit of an impatient road rage behind a muddy old sky blue pickup truck, and he's trying to make it back out of the foothills of North Carolina to Charlotte because he's late for his father-in-law's birthday party, a man for whom he works. And his business is most important. So, okay, there's this situation. And he ends up making a risky maneuver and ends up running this guy off the road. Keeps going. Runs him off the road because he's about to run headlong into a chicken truck that he had misgauged the distance on. Those of you who've read it, you know that. But what was the situation I was creating? A scenario in which these two people could end up on the side of the road together, standing there together in a situation where one of them has wronged the other, and the one who has wronged the other thinks that the other doesn't know it was him. Situation, okay? That's the situation. And a bit of city, country conflict in this one place, two worlds colliding. Did I outline the rest of it? No. But I had to write to get to that point. It's not a short story. And from there on, writing to find out what happens. And that story did not go where I had thought it would go. If you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. It almost couldn't have gone where I thought it was going to go, but it did, almost by itself. It's the only story I wrote entirely at night in my life, and I don't know if that affected it or not. It may have, since that story is titled Friday Afternoon, but finishes at night. But whatever influences there are, including music, I trust them. Any other questions? Yes.
It's not a question, it's a comment, just it might make you feel better about not teaching in the school. I've been retired for more than 20 years, and we taught a lot of emphasis on short stories and poetry. There's a book, I don't know, the title is so uncreative that you may know it, called Best Short Stories, and there's a junior high version and a senior high version. And I used the junior high version with my students, and it was unbelievable, the things that they came up with. And the stories that I remember from way back then, many of which I just made copies of because they were so good. And
Yeah.
It was alive and well 20 years ago in Richmond, New Jersey.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tremendous teaching tool. I wish that I had had the opportunity, and you can make your own opportunity. Yeah, if you're 12 years old, you can make your own opportunity and say, I'm gonna write a story. But I played 3 sports, and that was sort of my life, and I loved to read, but it would have been great looking back if a teacher had us write short stories, especially if it was in I hate the word module, but in a short story module. I just like to do them all year long. I might have wandered in this direction far sooner. As I said, as an English major, I had a professor who really brought along my interest in short fiction. A very deep immersion in the short works of F. Scott Fitzgerald. An example of an epic, great short story writer who wrote what some consider to be the greatest American novel, The Great Gatsby. He wrote that as a short story writer. Edgar Allan Poe said about the story that the great story and the good story has a singular effect. There is a unity of effect, singular effect on the reader that separates that story from weaker stories. Is something that lasts with the reader. I would like to have started earlier, than I did. And okay, we have our regrets. What are you going to do now? Go do it. Yes, you had your hand.
If I may piggyback on what she just said, I taught high school English for 32 years.
Oh wow!
And
I did see you nodding your head.
I couldn't do it today. I'd be in jail by the end of the week. That's a whole other story. Maybe that's worthy of a short story, perhaps. But
some of mine are set in school.
Having taught short story fairly extensively, I mean, I had a good long unit of it, but perhaps the best reinforcement that I received was when a former student years down the road got in touch with me to see if I remembered a particular short story because he was teaching and he couldn't find it and he wanted to teach it.
Oh, nice.
So that made my heart sing.
Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, because your work lives on through that next generation of teachers and parents. If we've influenced them to where they can bring that sensibility into parenthood, then we are immortal. And we can at least, there wasn't a lot of money to cash on Friday, but when I hear from past students order a signed copy of my book, that kind of, it's like, I'm gonna write you a paragraph. Because I remember you, and what I remember of you, I'm not surprised I'm hearing from you about this, because that's the way you were in 10th grade or in 12th grade, I mean, it is a connecting factor, which is why, when a lot of the public and even political influence seemed to be going so headlong towards STEM, I was worried, at the expense of the humanities, of the arts. I think that has happened. I've observed it in my own children's schooling, where I find myself supplementing at home what I think they're not getting, but they're getting lots of it in math and science, and especially math right now. my third grader, he brought home very little work in English or language arts, however you want to call it. I knew they were doing it, but it was more classroom-based. But he had lots of math homework, and he's way ahead of, entering fourth grade, he's way ahead of where I was coming out of third grade in math. But I don't feel kids are writing enough now. My daughters are graduating from high school, going to great colleges in the fall, honor students. But I can count, probably on one hand, definitely not more than one hand, but not more than two hands, the number of times that they've come home and had to work just on a simple 5-paragraph, 500-word essay. Like, well, where are you writing these essays? Or are you not writing these essays? No, we're not that. You know,
Wow.
what's expected of them as writers is not sufficient. And I don't know what we do about that, because that's how you become a thinker. And this country needs a lot more thinkers than we have right now. And school is, it can't be on the parents. It can't just be on the parents. And parents have never had to work more hours than they do now just to make ends meet. How are you supposed to teach your kid to become a better essay writer or a better critical thinker? How are you supposed to do that? You know, even the dinner table is different because of today's electronics. You know, it's just different. And the culture that they're growing up in. And that's not going to turn around and go back the other way. So how do you get them reading? How do you get them writing? But you know, this is why, you know, a few of my short stories are set in school. As Ann Serling, Ron Serling's daughter, told me, you know, she really loved Friday Afternoon, and she asked. This was before my first collection came out, so she had just read that as a standalone story on Kindle, and she asked me to send whatever stories I had for her and her sister to read them for a new anthology they were starting under the masthead of Rod Serling books, you know, honoring her father. And so she called me, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks after she would have received those stories. They were just Word documents at the time. And she said, you know, my father really would have liked you. I think he would have done a number of your stories. And she had already said that about Friday Afternoon, but now she was really kind of going there. And she said, I think that what he would have liked the most is that, like him, the subtext in your work goes more to commentary. And not preachy commentary, but is there a singular effect that comes from your work that isn't just the actual story itself? Is there something else at play? He always did. I mean, he used the Twilight Zone short stories, and they were short stories. He used that non-episodic series. The reason he would introduce science fiction and fantasy was to get around the censors, you know, because he had something to say, and so did the other writers, Richard Matheson, Charles Beaumont, Earl Hamner, who went on later to create the Waltons. Those were the Twilight Zone writers, and they were all like that. You know, they had something else going on in their work beyond entertaining you, while knowing that your first job is to entertain you. And if your work isn't entertaining, you're boring people. Well, you're not going to get to subtext, are you? You're not going to get to theme. You're not going to get to any level of influence but in a person's thinking, ethically, morally, however anyone wants to break that down. Yeah. Was there a hand back there a second ago? There was there and then here.
Your
Okay,
past
yes.
students, have any of them gone into publicizing their works?
Had they gone into
Have any of your past students publicized any works?
published?
Published,
Let's see. Yes, as a matter of fact, A student I had in Miami named Laura, she's now in her, oh my God, mid-30s, and is a mom, and is a published author in Colorado. And we are in the process right now, I'm tardy, but she sent me a signed copy of her book, and I'm sending her a signed copy of this one. I said, which one do you want? She said, I love novels, could you send me Reciprocity? Sure. So we're trading, and I like to do that with other writers, but wow, to do it with a former student who is a writer now is very special. It's very rewarding. There are a couple more, but I don't. They've written to me to say they're writing, but they're trying to break through, and it's a very, very tough barrier to break through, to be read. You know, it's tough.
Don't forget your students here.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I think there is about to be a story about the White Oak writers.
Oh, good.
The Hampton paper and the Jasper paper and Bluffton Today, they're all, I think, part of the same concern. And Michael DeWitt, who runs the Hampton and Jasper, or Hampton or Jasper, they are, I don't know if it's this week or not, but they are publishing the Dan Conover review of Reciprocity that was in Island News last week. Anybody see that Island News? I know they published Dan Conover's review. Low Country Weekly published John McElroy's review. Is John still here?
He's just
Yeah,
walking out.
which just knocked me to the floor. It was such a great
We're
review. I told him there's a really good job waiting for you at Kirkus, man. You know, that just wow. And Dan Conover, former city editor of the Charleston Post and Courier, he's a full-time novelist now, but he wrote a tremendous review that's was in Island News last week and is going to be in the Bluffton, Jasper, and Hampton papers of this book. And
I recognize that one.
what was that?
Yes,
Oh,
ma'am.
yes. Yeah, if he is still here.
He just walked out.
He just
Oh,
had to
he just
go.
walked out?
He's got a hospice
This-
bathroom.
There is going to be
It's
a
tomorrow, right?
launch. Well, the book comes out tomorrow, and there is going to be a launch party, mark it down. There's going to be a launch party, book signing at the Louis Reeve Sam's house on Bay Street, the historic Louis Reeve Sam's house. 601 or 602 Bay Street. I can't remember which, but they have hosted, the Myerses who own that home, have hosted our Short Story America opening reception at four of the five Short Story America conferences that we have held. All of them have been held in Beaufort, because I founded Short Story America here in Beaufort. And so that's going to continue there. And so if you can make it, Saturday, June 25th. Saturday, June 25th is John McElroy's, affectionately known as Mac McElroy. That is a really fine short story collection right there. And so that's 4 to 6 on Saturday, June 25th, if you can possibly make it. He is going to read. He's asked me to read, and I said, well, you know, if you order me to read, I'll read. But I would only read short stories. That's going to be a short fiction event. So I'll probably read one short story. I think he's going to read pretty extensively from this book. And that book really belongs on your nightstands. It's a very fine book. Brooke, you should sell that book here.
That would give a nudge because my story was selected by you for Short Story America
Yeah.
in 2018, I think.
Yes.
And that was from the novel Rising Fawn, and that is here, and it's been out for years.
Rising Fawn is here, everyone, and that is a terrific short story.
And there will be a sequel to that story, to that book, and Tim and I didn't know each other. You said, your character Cheryl needs to be in a movie. So
Yeah,
I'm gonna revisit Cheryl.
The character Cheryl is just a great character, yes.
She's gonna be in the next book too.
Yeah. Let's do another question, and then I'm gonna read for you.
Thank you for your words about how you write. That's I find that really interesting. And I look forward to being a fan. I've not read anything that you've ever written, so I'm looking forward to that. My question is, I go to many of these events. I'm always been an avid reader. And these events are always dominated by women. Now, surely that's not your fan base, or is it?
Well, for my short fiction, I would say about probably 60%, just from my travels.
Okay.
Doing, especially from the tour from my first collection, probably 65% of the readers of my short stories appear to have been women.
Now, would you expect more men in a book like
I
this?
had-
Or women read thrillers as much as men?
I had a friend call me last night from Charlotte that I was friends with when I lived in Charlotte many years ago. He had gotten this off of Amazon. He said, I have Friday Afternoon News Stories. Reading for Eisenhower, no, because that hasn't come out on Amazon and all that. He likes to do Amazon. And he was on chapter 7 of this book. He said, I am completely, totally, entirely hooked. He said, I'm not sure that I totally got all your short stories the way that a lot of your readers do. And that might kind of go to what you're saying. He's ex-military. He was a non-commissioned officer, a corporal in the Army. Was in the first Iraq War. He likes more rough and tumble novels when he reads, and he said, that's not very often. He said, but I'm going to tell you right now, if this keeps going the way it's going, it's the best book I've read in a very long time. But he's not a short story guy.
Okay.
I was as a reader, my interests were eclectic, going all the way back. I could devour the short stories of Scott Fitzgerald, which are not crime thrillers. Devour them, want to talk about them, and in the next minute, I am already 5 chapters into the new Robert Ludlum novel. Those are not the same animal. I like both to be entertained and to be made to think. So if I am enjoying it, I'm going to go find more of what you've written. So a guy like Mike is going to want to see more of this. But what I want is the person who likes my short stories to read this and to like it just as much. And that was the thing I loved about Dan Conover's post a week or 2 ago. He shared the Island News online version of his review on Facebook. And then he said, in his post, he said, what I like about Tim Johnston's stuff is, I'm already a fan of his short stories, is that he brings to the crime thriller, he brings literary sensibilities, was his term, literary sensibilities to the crime thriller. I couldn't be happier with a phrase than with that. Literary sensibilities to the crime thriller. Can it entertain you and do something else? And because that's what I like. Again, that's what I like to read. Yeah. So that was a good question. Very, very good question. Yeah.
May I say something else?
Yes.
Many of you people in here are teachers, obviously English teachers. I'm a teacher also, but a science teacher. And when I go to these things, often authors will say, how many of you in the room are writers? And I spent the last 10 years of my career doing scientific writing, okay? And I never have felt like I could raise my hand. But that's what I spent my career doing. Now, why I feel so inferior to you people that write these creative things. But I've never raised my hand.
Yeah.
You people are, your creativity just astonishes me. My writing had a purpose that was always outlined for me, I guess. But that wasn't always true of grants, and you can be creative, but I never have felt like I could raise my hand, even though that's what I did.
Yeah.
I know, but.
You should.
I know, but
Diane
what
Gamble's
you
on
do
this
is,
is
what you
what-
all do that do this are, it's so much more creative. And I
Yes.
just, really think it's wonderful.
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, you should raise your hand. An old cliche that teachers know, there is no such thing as a stupid question.
Oh, yeah, I know that's right.
I believe that very strongly. Including even when you ask a question that maybe has already been answered in some way, it's still, you shouldn't be, laughed at, by people who think, don't you already know the answer to that question? I would not allow students in my classroom to ridicule anybody else for seeming to be behind or seeming to not get it. Ask the question. Are you curious? Ask the question. If you want to make sure you understand something, ask the question. And whether you're going to be tested on it or not. In school, yeah, you're going to be tested on it, but you're not going to be tested on it. But you want to know, so you ask. Yes, you ask the question. Yeah.
Just a quick question. I read Friday Afternoon. The day before, Rod Serling's daughter was at Book Sandwich Inn.
Mm-hmm.
And I've read a lot of your short stories. I bought all the anthologies and all of that. I came away from Friday Afternoon with a feeling that it was very readable, and I could write that. And I think that's very appealing in a writer, that it's understandable, you like the story, and you say, I could write that. Of course, that's not, the last part is not true. I could not write that. Wait. So my question is, how many in your filing cabinet, how many Roger, thinking he could write Friday Afternoon, sit there waiting for you to finish them? How many things have you started writing where, because you don't have an outline?
Oh, how many have eyes?
Yeah, how many of you started and you said, this is going nowhere, I'm out of ideas?
It's funny that you, okay, here are my two collections. Okay, all right. This is Friday Afternoon and Other Stories. Okay, all right, and this one is Reading for Eisenhower, essentially, and Other Stories. It's subtitled stories. It's not a story. There is a story in there titled Reading for Eisenhower. It's not about but there are 3 stories in this collection that I rejected for this collection because at the time I didn't think they were good enough. When the problem with my thinking was, at the time they were just different from some things that I considered traditional. So my thinking, with the dozen stories here was, these are everybody's gonna like all 12 of these stories. There are 3 stories in here that are experimental to the point of me doubting myself in thinking that the experimentation I did would be accepted by others. Yeah. And I was wrong. I put those 3 stories past several very good beta readers, and they all responded the same way. That's really great, and I haven't seen it done that way before. I doubted my own originality.
Yeah.
My own sense of, almost inventing another narrative form that I would use. When it's not an invention, I've read somebody that's written something like that.
Yeah.
There's a story in here that I could only write in interior monologue. You know what interior monologue is? It is just straight delivery of a character's thoughts directly onto the page, and nothing else is interior monologue. One big voiceover, but where the character is not aware of an audience. Okay, sometimes with voiceover, the character is aware of an audience. Voiceover, it turns out somebody's talking to a police detective at the end of the movie. That's what it turns out they've been telling the story to. Well, the reality was, when I decided I had to use interior monologue, I had already been influenced by Dorothy Parker's story was the best way for her to tell the story, and that's why when she looked at the menu of narrative points of view, she chose that one. And well, so, there were a few stories in here where I had thought that way.
Yeah.
It has to be done this way, and it ain't traditional. Well, I was wrong. They did belong in a book, and they're in this one. But yeah, they had been filing cabinet shut.
Yeah.
Fortunately, still there. You know, in my Word documents, they were still there when I started to pull together stories that had already been written and published in various places for this collection. Then to fill it out, I also wanted to look at again some stories that I'd written and abandoned. And you come back even years later, and if you read it, you're reading it as somebody else. You're reading it as somebody who's just picked it up. And you're not you. And then if it's good, okay, in it goes. Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Any other quick questions? Yes.
Very quick. Have you ever used a coach, or do you agree with coaches, writing coaches? Someone that you contract with for a year, they take you from the first chapter to quote-unquote publishing?
No, I have done that for several other authors, but I have not engaged someone for that. But I think I would have, depending on my own level of development, in being honest with myself. And so it's really a case-by-case, to each his own kind of thing. You certainly don't want to hire someone who could even steer you down the wrong path, or create doubt in your work that shouldn't be doubted. That can happen too. I told you, and I think a couple other people last night, a story that I won't tell publicly, but you know what I'm talking about, where something was said to me that could have really damaged my confidence. When I already knew that I was good at this, and the person did not have the judgment that I felt that I had. And you know, just sort of did a little put down of some of my work that ended up in this book. It ends up putting a book award. Well, it doesn't mean that person, you know, I mean, it doesn't mean that person is not qualified to say something, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're right. If you hire someone, they probably are right a lot of the time, but when you can overrule, you can override that, but as long as you're honest with yourself and really look at why you think they said what they said. But no, I haven't engaged anyone to do that for me. But I also, you know, this isn't advertised, but I am hired by other authors to edit their manuscripts. It's not something I put out there publicly because time is an enemy. But I do get hired to do that. And selective, again, I won't just say yes to anyone who wants to hire me. But if I know something about them, where they send me a sample of their work, then I can give them an answer. And in those cases, they have benefited from doing that, and made that clear to me that they benefited from it. But I am very clear with them when I make a suggestion. It doesn't mean I'm right. You're paying me to point things out to you that I think, you know, that I am making a comment on, or a suggestion, or even write the words you need to. But that does not make me automatically right. When it comes to your story, you are God at the end of the day. But you can certainly pay for good advice.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Ready for us to read? Ready for, yep, there we go. Who here has, I'm going to start with a little bit of shorthand. Who here has read this book? Is there any story in this that's not Friday afternoon, because it's too long? It takes 50 minutes to read that in public. I know because I've done it. Okay. But is there a story in here, because they might even be recording this, that you would like to hear read by the author that's in this book? Not that you have the titles memorized. Want me to run through the titles real quick? They're only 12. They're only 12. Oh, you have your hand up.
I love that story about the Civil War soldier.
The Interruption of Thomas Darrow. That's been a popular story. Yeah, that's what they asked me to read at the Burns Club of Atlanta in March. It was my first in-person event since before COVID. And I was their guest speaker for March, and that was a request from the audience, was the Interruption of Thomas Darrow. So you want me to read that? I mean, those of you who haven't, that is the only work of historical fiction that I've ever written. It's the only work that is set in a particular moment in history. And let me turn to the story. I'll read you the very short little preface to it. 157. And this is the story that was picked by Anne Serling and her sister to go into the book from Rod Serling Books. And they picked this one. She had already read Friday Afternoon, but I think they were also watching Length, because Friday Afternoon is, it's a 40-page story. So, this image right here, okay, is a photograph that was taken at the July 1865 execution of the 4 convicted co-conspirators in the Lincoln assassination. Okay, this is in the penitentiary yard in Washington, what was then known as Washington City, before the actual hanging occurs. So if you can see this picture, you'll see some umbrellas. It was a dreadfully hot, the sun was blazing, humid, hot, hot, hot. So there were some umbrellas that the officials, were using, the officiants of the hanging and the preparation for hanging. If you notice here, the woman seated here is Mary Surratt, okay? And I've studied Lincoln all my life, and including the aftermath of the assassination. And it's always struck me that these men who are preparing this woman to be hanged, she's sitting in a chair on top of the trap door. And they are holding an umbrella chivalrously over her to protect her from this aggressive sun. And it always just hit me, always hit me. So it found its way into the story too, of course. But the story is set at this event. And the central character is one of these Union soldiers up on the penitentiary wall. They're observing. And some of them are also turning and giving a play-by-play to the massive crowd outside of this wall. People like to attend executions, take picnics, So that's, these Union soldiers are up on the wall, okay. And you have Mary Surratt, Lewis Payne, which you can see his leg there. He's seated. He was a tall man and a strapping, strong guy, and he was a very brave Confederate soldier who was one of Booth's co-conspirators for the assassination and for the kidnapping plot that preceded it. And then you have George Atzerodt, who was assigned by Booth to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. This was all supposed to happen simultaneously because it was an overt effort coup. And then to the right is a 20-year-old kid named David Harold, and his job as one of the co-conspirators was to get Lewis Payne, whose real name was Lewis Powell, out of Washington. Because Payne wasn't very familiar with Washington. They all had to get out. They wanted to do it with impunity. So do it, get out. David Harold's one job was to get Lewis Payne, out of Washington. So they were all going to run to the south. And their hope, Booth's hope, was we get a reset. You know, because the chaos that will ensue, you know, if Lincoln's dead, if Johnston's dead, if William Seward, the Secretary of State, is dead, they were all supposed to die at the same time. And then throws it to Congress, who's gonna be president. Crazy, yet not unimaginable sequence.
Do you think?
Right.
Seriously.
It's like, you know,
Those entertainers, they'll do it every time.
now Booth's plot just a couple weeks earlier was they were going to kidnap Lincoln from his stagecoach on the way to what was called the Old Soldier's Home, which was the version then of Camp David. And he would go there some weekends. He was supposed to be going. And they were there to waylay the stagecoach, and it never came. Lincoln had changed his mind, they didn't go. So a few days before this event, Lincoln came to the balcony of the White House. Word got around quickly. Lincoln was going to give an impromptu speech. And he did. And there's a crowd below. Booth was in the crowd. People later remembered, yeah, Booth was there. They also remember what he said. Because Lincoln, for the first time, he made reference to the vote for the black man. We're going to give the franchise to black people. That's what we're going to get ready to do in my second term, which had begun. And Booth was quoted by several bystanders as turning to someone else and saying, I hate to use this word, but he turned to someone and said, the nigger vote, I'll run him through. He's a Shakespearean actor, he liked to talk like that. I'll run him through. I'll run him through. But that's when it shifted towards assassination, and it's why, from everything I've read, I do not believe that Mary Surratt knew that he was going to kill Lincoln. She did know he was going to kidnap him. She was not innocent, but she was innocent, I believe, of the plot to kill him, and so she should not have hanged. So that's where we are in terms of a little bit of setup for this story, okay? All right, 157. Here we go. All right, and Mary Surratt was the first woman to be executed by the United States government. Private Thomas Darrow employed his moist blue uniform sleeves, right, then left, then right again, to mop sweat from his forehead and dripping nose. Then he applied the heels of his palms to mat and smooth his quilly red beard, which itched incessantly in the summer heat. Indeed, the setting was muggy, but of course it was July, and he had borne heat of far greater discomfort than this. He repeated the matting for the third time in the past minute, and pondered whether his doing so was to mask, on the one hand, or to signal on the other, his agitation at Delahanty's endless chattering about the damned woman. From his perch upon the wall, he glanced back at the crowd behind him on the ground, 20 feet below. The faces of the ticketless Slavs offended Private Darrow with their eager, morbid hunger for any shred of news about the prisoners. For God's sake, he thought, go home. It's just a hanging, he was about to mutter to himself. But of course, it was not just a hanging, and his attention regrettably returned to the gibberish spewing from Delahanty's tobacco-drenched mouth. All kind of things in my time, but a woman? How do you hang a woman? Tommy, you ever seen such a thing? A woman? The stench of Delahanty's breath was powerful in the oppressive heat. Back up, Jack. I can hear you. Delahanty retreated a half step, pointed down at the proceedings before them in the shipyard. Tommy, we're about to see a woman hang. Ain't that bother you? Private Darrow stroked his beard thoughtfully, then matted it forcefully again in agitation. When he spoke, he didn't look at Delahanty. The president's dead. Someone's got to pay. Just Just because she's a woman doesn't mean she gets special privileges. Remember what the Major said this morning. The wheels of justice must turn, and turn they shall. Remember, that's what he said. What a woman, Tommy, whispered Delahanty, gripping Private Darrow's right arm. Darrow ripped his arm away and turned to glare down at the little nuisance. Listen, Jack, and listen good. I'm tired, all worn out from your futile ramblings about this woman. I'm not wanting to see it either, but it's not as if she's the Virgin Mary. He paused to look without expression at the four gallows standing in wooden unison below. Just unlucky is all. Unlucky? Tommy, you got a lot more education than me, but I gotta tell you, unlucky ain't the word. Major Highsmith says she didn't have nothing to do with it. Yeah, maybe Booth and them others would come to her house, but maybe she didn't know nothing about killing the Private Darrow wheeled and cuffed Delahanty by the ear, not letting go. He ignored the putrid tobacco odor and peered into the little soldier's eyes from a distance of not more than 5 inches. I know all about it, Jack. I don't need you to be my newspaper. Got it? Delahanty appeared to get it and shrank frailly until Darrow released his ear. Delahanty rubbed the ear with delicate care. Sorry, Tommy. Jesus. Get no sleep last night? Darrow didn't answer. A hush had fallen over the soldiers lining the wall and populating the yard below. A voice on the wall, 5 or 6 soldiers to Darrow's right, hissed to the crowd outside the wall. The conspirators! They're coming out! Soon! God save us all! Darrow strained to see who this announcer was. Recognizing the speaker, Darrow shook his head faintly. It was George Fan, the Bible-quoting corporal from western Pennsylvania. This didn't surprise Private Darrow, as he despised Corporal Fan's obnoxious, loud piety. It had never seemed to Darrow, in the 5 months since first meeting the inebriated Fan in the saloon on Water Street, that Fan's actions fit his stated beliefs. He had told Fan precisely such on several sober occasions, but Fan had dismissed Darrow's observations as excessive worry about nothing. Fan had gushed that there was nothing more believable than inconsistency, and Darrow had thrown up his hands and left it to one of the others to try talking sense to the lush. A man in the crowd yelled, "The Surratt woman? She coming out?" Fan hissed back, "Soon! The door ain't opened yet, but no clemency's what we hear." This revelation drew speculative conversation among the crowd of people who would hear, but not witness, the abrupt termination of 4 lives on the condemned side of the wall. Darrow stared at the door through which the prisoners would eventually emerge. He wondered whether she would enter the yard first. Indeed, it would fit the warped sense of propriety and honor which these damned Lincolnite hypocrites exhibited every single day of their lives. Women first, he thought. At least in the South they meant it, only for the good things. But here in Washington, they get it wrong all the time. Through doors, onto carriages, yes, that was fine. But now even to the gallows, now that Stanton and his minions would have their way. Ah, damn son of a bitch, Stanton. He's eliminating everyone he knows about, Darrow mused. For weeks, Darrow had wondered, sometimes in curiosity and sometimes in desperate fear, what happened to Booth's diary? Everyone knew he kept one, and fanatically at that. So whatever happened to that goddamn thing? He didn't think his own name would be there, but knowing Booth and his attraction to posterity, well. "Tommy," exclaimed Delahanty, poking Darrow's arm. "They're coming out." The door in the sun-drenched wall was open. It was so goddamn hot. Darrow's heart began to pound, even in his teeth. Apparently there were final farewells being finished emotionally, as wails of lamentation assailed Darrow's consciousness through the portals of his ears. And then there was movement. Indeed, Mrs. Surratt emerged first from the dark hell of the penitentiary, flanked and seemingly held up by two priests, who in turn were escorted by a blue-coated soldier. As soon as she became illuminated by the July sun, Mrs. Surratt appeared to faint, her fall interrupted by the support from the two priests. Atzerodt was next out the door, shuffling along in unnecessary shackles, unnecessary due to the armed soldiers hustling him along. David Harold made a poor accounting of himself, sobbing and teetering as he was pushed out the door by cursing soldiers. What a pathetic exit, Darrow judged. And then out marched Louis Payne, square shoulders, chin up, barefoot, as if saying that his natural state was bravery, that it was his natural state he would take with him into eternity. His natural state. The idea of Payne strangely roiled Darrow's stomach. It always had. His Spartan attitude and total commitment to cause, without ambiguity, had seemed stupid, dense, stone cold to others. But to Darrow, Payne was the epitome, damn it all to hell, of dedication. Dedication without selfishness. And this combination in Payne had cost Darrow many hours of sleep in the past several weeks. A straw hat was atop Payne's head. Most of the soldiers on the wall tittered in mocking amusement, as clearly had been the goal of the individual who had placed the sailor's straw on the proud condemned killer's pate. Of course, Lincoln was the one who had deserved to die. Darrow wasn't opposed to the deaths of those who deserved it, and the invader tyrant surely qualified. But Mrs. Surratt? Perhaps Payne deserved to die for being inept enough to botch the job on the old man Seward, and Booth had said Payne was a born killer. And then having the colossal brain hemorrhage to not get out of Washington while the getting was good. And Atzerodt. Well, there was a waste of Earth's oxygen anyway. Darrow had long been convinced that Atzerodt was around for just two reasons. Booth liked to surround himself with lesser men, and hence Darrow had committed himself to the mission itself far more than to the man. And assigning Atzerodt to Vice President Johnston was a superior method of implicating Johnston himself in the plot, since there was no chance of Atzerodt actually going through with it. Two birds with one stone in that event. Lincoln dies, Seward dies. Johnston is implicated in the newspapers by his mere survival and by Booth's note to Johnston at the hotel. Johnston is hence limited to the weakest possible presidency for 4 years while the South reconstructs itself. As much as Darrow despised Booth and his cocky ego, the plan had been a sound one. If only it had been carried off with the efficiency Darrow himself had shown in getting that idiot Metropolitan Guard, Parker, away from the president. How many of you know that the guard placed out of Lincoln's box left his post?
Didn't hear that.
The guard, John F. Parker, the Metropolitan Police Guard, who was on a White House detail, was assigned to guard President Lincoln's box, left his post. He wasn't there. Booth arrives with a single-shot Derringer. So he's not going to use it on the guard. He's there to kill Lincoln. How does he know the guard's not going to be there? The lock had been messed with, and so the door didn't lock. It would appear that Booth knew that the box would be unguarded and unlocked. And that's a fact in history. And what history doesn't know is why John Parker left his post. Apparently to go drinking at a saloon next door, which did fit his own level of dereliction as a police officer. Reality is that he was not involved, but he did leave his post. So why did he leave his post? How did Booth know he was going to leave his post? Well, it was an easy mark, easy to get to leave his post, especially for a drink. So in studying this part of history, what I, as a writer, wanted to invent, and a fiction writer can invent it, is who did that? who got him to leave his post. Okay, so that's where you are. All right. In getting that idiot Metropolitan Guard Parker away from the president. The problem, to Darrow's regret, was not Booth's death. His survival would have bordered upon miraculous. The problem was in Payne's failure to kill Seward and get away. Without Payne on the gallows, they could never hang Mrs. Surratt today. They could never hang David Harold. They could never hang Atzerodt. Payne is the only person in captivity who had committed violence toward the president's cabinet on that fateful April night. There could be no second, third, and fourth noose without Payne's drenched white noose in the summer sun. Booth's error in retrospect was in not ensuring that Harold would get Payne out of Washington. Abandoning Payne was a mistake of enormous proportion, and Darrow resented the mistake with every ounce of his will. And he's standing up here in a Union uniform on the wall. Because of that mistake, Darrow found himself staring down at 4 fresh, open graves on a brutally hot summer morning, aware of the fact that among the throng of soldiers and government officials about to witness the murder of an innocent woman on this horrible day, only Louis Payne, David Harold, George Atzerodt, George Fan, Mary Surratt, and Private Thomas Darrow knew that Mrs. Surratt, due in minutes to be the first woman ever executed in the United States, was innocent of the crime of conspiring to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. And Private Thomas Darrow believed in God deeply. He and God had 3 secrets together. God knew that Darrow had lured Parker from his post outside Lincoln's box to the tavern next door to Ford's Theater, where George Fan had proceeded to buy Parker a total of 3 jolts of whiskey. God had wanted this action from Thomas Darrow, and Darrow had accepted this responsibility proudly. It was why one James Trombley had left Tennessee 9 months ago to become one Private Thomas Darrow of Pennsylvania in the first place. God knew that Thomas Darrow hated the knowledge, despised it, feared it, the knowledge that he could personally end Mrs. Surratt's suffering only by replacing her on the gallows himself. And God knew that Thomas Darrow was afraid to die young, and that the only greater fear in his heart was that of dying humiliated. An elbow from Delahanty jerked Darrow from his reverie. A man in white clothing and a white wide-brimmed hat had stepped out of the doorway into the sunlight. He appeared to be beckoning the prisoners and their escorts to trudge the short, hot distance to the scaffolding, which so ominously and ignominiously bore 4 nooses. Above the stark open graves dug into the disgusting humidity, the platform awaited a mindless Spartan warrior, a no-account idiot, an impressionable child, and an innocent middle-aged woman. These 4 would be sacrificed by a new nation to the termination of the direction of the past. Of all of them, it was the mindless warrior whose sheer sense of dumb honor so frightened Private Darrow. The honesty of Payne's guilt, coupled with Mrs. Surratt's horrific suffering, poured into Darrow's soul like acid as he stood watch with his federal comrades atop the penitentiary wall. The prisoners were positioned behind their respective nooses, their backs to Darrow and the other soldiers lining the high wall. To Darrow's far left, Atzerodt stood still with shoulders slumped. Harold wobbled in place next to Atzerodt. Payne stood like an oak in defiance of the crowd of soldiers in the yard below. Mary Surratt was helped into a chair several feet behind her waiting rope. Absurdly, an umbrella was used to shield the condemned woman from the wicked sun. Darrow pondered the meaning of men protecting a woman from the sun in the finest tradition of respectful honor toward a lady, and then minutes later, the same men tightening a noose around her neck and plunging her to a violent, lonely, and humiliating death illuminated by the same uncaring sun. Vaguely, Darrow considered that such duplicitous treatment of a human being might one day become common. Who knew what the reconstructed nation would be like? Suddenly there was a commotion in the yard below. Payne had uttered something heard only by the men on the scaffold and several soldiers below. Delahanty nudged Darrow. "What did he say, Tommy?" Delahanty whispered. Before Darrow could answer, Payne yelled into the yard. This time all could hear. "The woman is innocent!" he cried. "The woman is innocent." The man in white, preparing a gray hood for Mary Surratt's head, paused to look at Payne. All activity on the scaffold stopped for a moment. And then the men on the platform resumed their work in binding the prisoner's ankles together to reduce the unsightly convulsions somewhat, as it would not do to have a hanged woman's undergarments visible to the soldiers below. Darrow stared at the back of Payne's sturdy head as a white cloth was used to join Payne's ankles together. Payne had proudly projected the awful words which had plagued Darrow's sleep for these last weeks. Strange, Darrow thought, that Payne could say those words 100 times and the woman would still die an unjust death. But were Private Thomas Darrow to utter those same words, the woman would live another 30 years. He could do it, he thought. He could do it. Just blurt the words. Blurt them and be done with it. Of course, to make the words count, he would have to confess his role and complicity in the plot to kill the president. After all, the simple fact that Lincoln would still be alive if Darrow had failed to get Parker away from his post meant that Darrow's role was second only to Booth's. Until the past several weeks, Darrow had been immensely proud of himself, regretting only that history would never know his name. Confounded history, he had thought in repeated daydreamings following the assassination. He had done something truly historic, and history would not note his name nor his actions. He would have to suffer, to be humiliated, to die publicly and 50 years premature in order for history to record his great action. It wasn't fair. Lincoln was already virtually deified by his death. Booth's name would live on in Southern lore, certainly. Payne would be remembered for his stoic bravery, and now, confound it, he would also be remembered for chivalrously attempting to save the woman's life in the minutes before his own end. Even Atzerodt and Harold would be noted by history. If Darrow were to remain silent, as he had for these past months, he would live on for an anonymous 4 or 5 decades, taking wife, raising children, safe from suffering and humiliation and premature death. It simply was not fair that a man who was clever enough to escape detection would have to purchase those 3 awful tickets as price for immortality. The words filled his lungs, wanting out of their prison within him. "We are the truth," the words said. "Give us life. The woman is innocent." He could say those words. He really thought he could. He glanced over at the obnoxious George Fan, who was enjoying the event. Fan was unconcerned with posterity and equally concerned with his own welfare. Fan would never lose a minute's sleep over the woman's death or his own anonymity in the record of human history. Darrow envied Fan for his inability to consider either the injustice to the woman or the prospect of anonymity in the roll call of those who impacted human events. Darrow turned his attention back to the stalwart Payne. As if sensing Darrow's gaze, Payne inexplicably turned, his stare traveling determinedly up the wall. His eyes, dark and emotionless, found Darrow's and attacked with the brute, cold force which Payne was reputed to have exhibited on the battlefield. Payne's stare challenged Darrow in a manner fit for Southern honor. The eyes seemed to say, "I hold your life in my hands, Thomas, just as you hold the woman's life in yours. We are each like unto God at this moment." all of my dumb Spartan honor, I choose to spare your life, comrade, so that you may spare hers by choosing to sacrifice your own. Speak now so that they may believe you. Her noose will become yours, and that is as it should be. Join me, Thomas. Take honor and courage with you into eternity. Delahanty tapped Darrow on the elbow, jolting him again from his reverie. Tommy, you okay? What's the matter? Hey, he really looks like he's looking at you. Darrow did not answer. Payne held his gaze a few seconds longer, and then a gray canvas hood was drawn over the warrior's face and tightened under his chin, leaving him sightless. Yet, even with the hood and Payne's face turned back toward the baking yard below, Darrow could still see those emotionless eyes. He would never escape them. Moments later, all four condemned were hooded and bound at the ankles and behind the back at the wrists. Two men held Mary Surratt up as her knees buckled repeatedly. You can do it, Thomas. Say the words. Take her place. Darrow squeezed both pant legs at the thigh. The nooses were fitted around the fornecks below. To his right, Darrow heard George Fan yell something about the doors of hell opening wide beneath the four graves. Damn hypocrite, Darrow thought. Fan is taking it too far. I'm guilty. I got Parker to go to the tavern with me. I didn't like Booth, but I liked what he wanted to do, and I had been drinking with Parker on several occasions. I had a drink with him. The woman is innocent. Free her. The woman is innocent. I know, because I am guilty. It would take 20 seconds to confess. Another 20 to waive the trial. 20 seconds. The four condemned were positioned, nooses tightened atop the long trap door. 20 seconds. That's all it would take. And just two, even one, to stop this madness. Darrow drew a breath. It could be done. The difference between cowardice and courage is action. Not attitude, not intent, not conscience. Action. He would say the words. He was sure of it now. The woman is innocent. It would freeze them, freeze the proceedings. He would nobly surrender, declare the woman innocent, watch her weep gratefully as he would be let off in shackles. And she would attend his execution, declaring to all who would listen that this condemned man epitomized honor and selflessness and truth and both moral and physical courage. This man, Darrow, she would say in her memoirs, was the ultimate example of true manhood. He would say the words, proclaim them loudly. The woman is innocent. The chroniclers of history would describe the moment in noble language. The masters would paint him, standing tall on the wall, tearing away the blue uniform to reveal the brave home gray underneath. And songsters like Stephen Foster would enter his story into musical legend to be sung by campfires throughout the South. Yes, he would say the words. Again, he drew in a breath. The woman is innocent! Darrow looked around in horror. Had he really said them? The words, though muffled, had been heard clearly throughout the yard below and atop the wall, but they were ignored by the throng of humanity which had grown tired of hearing them. The signal was given anyway by the man in the white clothing and hat. The long trap door swung down and opened violently, and the four souls fell. Long after the twitching of the other three bodies had subsided, Louis Payne still struggled at the end of his rope. Tears welled in Darrow's eyes. Payne had robbed him. He had been about to say the words. Payne had rushed to say them first. And now Payne battled at the end of his rope, neck unbroken, fighting to the last. It was entirely unfair. Darrow had been about to say the words. damn it all to hell, he had been about to say the words. Darrow turned away from the sight of the hooded, barefoot body wriggling in the sun. Facing the crowd outside the wall, he gazed out over the landscape and realized that he had done the right thing by deciding to say the words. He really had decided, and that was the important thing. If pain had not interrupted, the woman would be alive. It was, after all, Payne's second mistake of import. Payne had failed to kill Seward, and now had failed to save Mrs. Surratt by interrupting Private Thomas Darrow. Later in the afternoon, Darrow was pensive as he drank several beers with Delahanty, staring into the golden liquid in his bar mug. He was glad that he had taken the step of deciding. And while fate had caused the interruption by Payne, Darrow resolved now to go forth into his 30s, 40s, and 50s, and eventually make a difference, which he saw now that he was indeed destined to make. After all, he had made one before. Darrow drained his glass, clapped Delahanty on the shoulder, and strode purposefully out of the tavern and into the teeming street. Yeah. That's the one the Serlings decided to put into, they could pick whatever they wanted, and that's the one interesting because some Twilight Zone stories involve some level of the supernatural and some do not. So this falls into the latter, where Serling and those writers would go very deeply into examination of character. And this is one of those types of tests. How many of you think that he had really decided?
Yeah, that's such a great metaphor.
Yeah.
But it's, you ask yourself all kinds of hypotheticals, and as a writer, you better be examining yourself when you write about a character. You really need to take a look inward, and anyone, if you've studied this history and you read the story knowing that he didn't interrupt the proceedings. But the challenge for an author is if you can get the reader to follow this to the end anyway, then you do get the subtext. Everyone really should take a look. What would I do? Because the real test did happen. A lot of scholars think that the hope was that by her being condemned to hang, that it would bring her son John Surratt home from hiding. He was in hiding. They eventually found him hiding out in the Papal Guard in Rome. Which is where they actually eventually found him. And he knew they were going to hang his mother. So I created a character, fictional character, facing the same exact dilemma that her son faced. He's wanted, and he's going to hang, and he doesn't come back and save his mother's life. But it's not a story about him wherever he was, Canada, Europe by then, who knows. And at the same time it is, he chose to save his own skin rather than his 44-year-old mother. That's always, when I'm puzzled enough, I like to go write a story. And in this case, it was a moment in history. How are we doing on time? Okay.
It closes at 4.
They closed the facility at 4? Oh, then we need to go. I'm going to be signing books in the next door room here. I didn't get to read from Reciprocity. And my short stories are entirely collected. So that's the one that's set in history. Way less dialogue in that story than my other stories because it called more for description than for dialogue. But all of my books are for sale in the room next door where I will be signing books. And so is at least volume 1 of the Short Story America series. That book is remarkable. It's 56 stories by today's authors. I'm the editor of that series. And that is a heck of a book to pick up today. And anyone who's interested in more than one book, the books are cover priced at $25 a piece, but 2 or more books, like let's say you don't have any of my books, they're each $20 if you buy more than one. So if you're gonna buy 2, then you might as well pay $40 for 2, then $25 for 1, and so on and so forth. I hate the process of talking about book prices and sales, but you have to, just so people know. But I will be in there signing, and I personalize every time someone says, "Can you personalize it?" Obviously I do. It's one thing I remember well about Pat Conroy. All of my books by Pat Conroy, he wrote personal inscriptions. As you know, I started dating my inscriptions in people's books because I saw that Pat Conroy did. And he would always put that day's date in it. There aren't that many writers that do that, but that became a habit for me after that. Brooke, thank you very much.
Hey, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you mind if I take, there aren't as many people now as there were 10 minutes ago, but do you mind if I take a picture of you? Brooke, could you just jump in right there?
Oh, yes.
Here, prop. Today's writers have to do what yesteryear's writers didn't have to do. They have to promote.
That's right.
You have to. Well, perfect. Yeah, sure.
Water bottle.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you gotta get the water
Oh, yeah,
bottle
water
out.
bottle. Okay. Okay.
But anybody's face.
Okay, I want to make sure you're all in there. Steve, Harrison.
I'm fine.
You're fine? You don't want to be in the picture? Okay, all right. Put that back far enough here. Okay, got it. Got it. All right. Thank you all so much. Thank you. I will be back if you all will have me. There are more personal.